A slowly emerging thought that first realized hits so hard that it makes you stop and take a breath, brings a tear to the eye. I had a dream last night, like thousands of other nights since 1991, that I was at Jeffrey Giuliano's Victorian mansion on the Erie Canal. Jeffrey was gone, and I was left in charge of things. The house was full of odd characters, strangers, devotees, rock stars, celebrities, journalists, the local police, people serving us papers. Even Jeffrey's wife and children made an appearance. Giuliano had successfully profiled the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Frank Sinatra, Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, Rod Stewart, Liz Taylor, Ronald Reagan, Michael Jordan, all of whom drifted in the mansion's hallways, the long halls, and the lawn in my dream. Sacred cows grazed the homestead's vast wild grounds. Saffron-robed Krishna devotees chanted and danced. The blue sky was alive with images of Krishna as a child, as a young man, as the supreme personality of Godhead. I knew Lenin was dead, yet I saw him wandering about as well. We even shook hands, and I asked him where he was now, what heaven was like. He said it was no different than a field of flowers, man. I had to write it all down to understand it. My subconscious was trying to tell me that Jeffrey, the author, was gone from my life, gone from Lockport, gone from the author's house, and I was and am now in charge. I am the author, and I am surrounded in the author's house of the mind by the characters. It was time for me to take control and tell the story. There's a mansion on the hill. Psychedelic music fills the air. They say love lives there still, in that mansion on the hill. Neil Young. It's not every day that you are standing outside a brothel in the red light district of Brussels, holding your boss's wallet and jewelry while he is inside getting a blowjob. A writer's assistant is called upon for such things as protecting the credit cards and diamonds from theft by a Belgian whore. I knew well what that whore saw when Jeffrey dropped his pants, or, if she persuaded him, took off his clothes. He was naked most of the time at his home where he lived with his wife Brenda, 4 children, and me, the literary intern. He awoke at 7, summoned me from my sleep in the guest apartment, and had his wife draw a bath. The downstairs bathroom was a large marble affair, with a 12-foot ceiling and a black lawn jockey standing next to the sink. He held a blank sign. Jeffrey bathed in a big, claw-footed tub where I took notes for a new chapter, and his wife washed or carefully braided his shoulder-length hair. He'd open with, "Now today you have to," which was followed by, "Clean the office, drive the children to school, make copies of the chapters to be mailed to his editors." Search the mansion's archives and rock memorabilia for names, places, dates, and photos. Standing for over 100 years on that Erie Canal-side hill, the mansion was once home to a number of Lockport eccentrics, including a piano maker who'd gutted the place of all valuables, including the stained-glass windows, before Jeffrey bought it. Now the walls were covered in framed 60s rock art, paisley illustrations, hilarious 50s product advertisements, renderings of Krishna in all his many incarnations, framed covers of Jeffrey's books, and sexual collages which he had created. While Jeffrey was inside with the Brussels prostitute, I wondered about the other night women in the windows, where they really lived, what languages they spoke, what the prices were for each service, if they liked what they did. And I thought of Jeffrey, home on a red riding mower in a sea of flowing grass, scooping up his second youngest, Avalon, to ride with him. Avalon, a 4-year-old, was always naked, too. Her mother got her dressed in the morning, but within minutes she had shed her clothes, just like her father. "We are hippies here," Jeffrey said to explain the weirdness. The Giulianos wrote, listened, prayed, argued, observed, preached, and wandered through life naked. Now we were in Belgium, thousands of miles away from his family and our freaky literary office of operations. There were 20 windows, with writhing women in every one. I would look at one, and then look away quickly when she caught my gaze. A few waved me over, whites, blacks, Asians, French in leather, in the soft teddies, garters, stockings I had seen in Playboy and Penthouse. Some were bitchy, some innocent, some ambivalent. I personally had no money, and I was worried about the other men who intermittently prowled the brick street. If they might try something with me, try to get at Jeffrey's wallet, which only I knew I held, or try something else. Night was all around. The street lights of Brussels aglow, shaded softly by the history an American could never understand. This place was centuries old, not the mere hundreds of years like the States. Since the 7th century, pagans and kings had ruled here. Cities had been built and destroyed. The revolutions came. Napoleon invaded, and Brussels became the popular capital among the French, Germans, and Dutch. Americans flocked to London and Paris. Hugo and Marx wrote there. The people thought globally. We'd ventured too far, I thought. We didn't belong here. But America was here too, in small, though not wholly accepted doses. I saw a busy McDonald's, a Pizza Hut. Now in the district Geoffrey had picked a young woman in a cowboy hat and glasses. As we drew to the building, she turned out to be a tall, medium-chested, rather leggy redhead in a nylon see-through top, brilliant green spandex, and white pumps. There was a small speaker above her window playing Heartbreak Hotel. She knelt down slowly to eye us through the Ray-Bans. She was too much, dressed as too many male fantasies at once, a sexual superhero. But it was all legal here, no different than going to the market for fresh fruit. I told her I loved her, Geoffrey said. 10 minutes had passed, according to Geoffrey's Rolex, which I also kept safe. He walked slowly from the doorway of the red brick building. He looked up the street while he talked. I had never been to a brothel before, and I would not find out what it was like now. Why? I asked. Oh, I always tell them just before I come, I love you. It just happens. I can't control it. We walked in silence, though I had 1,000 questions. I didn't know which one to ask first. Geoffrey was now disheveled, flushed, nearly wheezing, a man who'd just enjoyed the passion of a French lady, but without the proper time to recover. We were briskly walking away from his encounter, from the criminal guilt that is so uniquely American. She didn't speak English, but it didn't matter. He stopped walking. The wallet? My rings, he said. I handed his things over. Now look, if my deals had worked already, had worked properly as I first envisioned in London, if I had my money, I'd have gotten one for you too. His necklaces and rings were all back in place. He jingled as he walked. That's okay. No, I'm sorry. Look, you should get laid here. I'll think about it, come up with something, but not tonight, though. I'd rather not. Don't be fucking gay. If I say you're getting laid, then you're going to get fucking laid. Being a writer is about going out there and doing a bunch of fucked up shit. You have to experience to be a writer. You think Dylan Thomas wouldn't have fucked a few of these whores? Fuck your little girlfriend back home in Lockport, huh? I was not offended, because I'd heard it all before. And these words were coming from the man who once told me that God had sent me to him. I was 22 years old. It was like I was under some kind of magical spell, a drug, mind control, and I would participate in such behavior and tolerate it and cover for him, in fact, even be a defender and advocate for him. He knew that I would not tell his wife about this encounter, or the other women who became his girlfriends during our travels. There was something there in the personality of Geoffrey, the artist, which tapped into my own artistic desires. I was happy to provide my resources to facilitate such behavior. In a world where young writers will do almost anything to be published, Geoffrey gave me my literary purpose, a future, a break from my small-town roots. My own scribbled fiction manuscript, The Way the Gentlemen Ride, was at his house. He had not read it, but promised to do so, promised to introduce me to the people who would recognize my talent, though I had not expected it when my internship began. God, too, was along with us on these crazy trips. I was part of a higher cause, though tempted by sin, that had been touched, even graced, by the god of Eastern India, the Lord Sri Krishna. While my mentor sinned, I could choose to be the pious, dutiful student. In the face of his admitted humanness, Geoffrey planned to start his own Krishna consciousness ashram and school with the hope of being closer to God. I was promised a place of leadership in the group. Geoffrey dreamed of hundreds, perhaps thousands, who would worship and study at his ashram. My mentor was far from perfect, far from a holy man. Yet he was the one who introduced me to a world of journalistic excitement and otherworldly spirituality. Geoffrey, clearly had work to complete, money to make with his book projects to support his wife and 4 children. Then he would leave the material world to practice his religion full time. Joining a cult without officially becoming a member, I was invited for both rides. Though I only took one, it was nearly impossible, even life-threatening, to jump off. The first time I saw Jeffrey Giuliano, I had no idea that he would, for better and for worse, become my literary mentor. I was the clerk at a bookstore in Lockport, a small Erie Canal town north of Buffalo. The place carried all the bestsellers, magazines, art books, used books, foreign language books, and rare volumes secured by the owner, a German book dealer. The store was a local curiosity, routinely filled with well-groomed, extremely lonely old men. The men were there for the small gay section at the back of the store, where explicit magazines and novels were displayed. Some men would spend $200 a whack on stacks of glossy, cellophane-sealed magazines. They often gave me a smile, wink, and one regularly offered me rides home after work. Publishing was much different in those days, riding a wave of 1980s drug and fashion books that turned Bret Easton Ellis, Jay McInerney, and Tama Jankowicz into tabloid celebrities. These authors made the covers of Esquire and Interview. They weren't the old-school Cheevers and Updikes who were featured in Newsweek for their exposés on the American suburbs. This was true gossip celebrity. Young, good-looking writers were cool again. They hung out in New York clubs, attended parties with Warhol, were chased by the paparazzi. Novels by Umberto Eco, Toni Morrison, Paul Auster, and William Gibson were displayed in the front windows of the bookstore, along with the classics. Don DeLillo had taken over as the mysterious recluse since Salinger had been silent so long. I read widely, and I wanted my little novel to open the door to the money, attention, and parties McInerney attended. I loved writing, wanting to be published for all the wrong reasons, and hoped that one day I would ride the coattails of another writer into my big dream. The first author I ever met just walked in the door, made his thundering entrance. I brightened. Certainly, he could help me. I had seen Jeffrey's name in the newspapers and had been told he had settled in Lockport after a number of years in Toronto. He wandered into the bookstore one day in flowing robes, decorated in beads and jewelry. He carried a small tan pouch that he softly jiggled. The bag sounded half full of peanuts. Jeffrey carried himself as large, authoritative, self-important. His paunch and stroll announced that there was a real author in the store, by the way. He looked like he drank and took acid every day, but in fact he was a teetotaler, naturally mad. His wife Brenda trailed him, holding a happy baby. A child of about 4 followed them. Brenda Giuliano was a pretty brunette, dressed quite unlike her husband in a preppy, loose-fitting purple sweater, jeans, and sandals. I was admittedly quite nervous. Jeffrey was the first famous person I had ever seen in person, other than a sportscaster from a Buffalo TV station. Writing about the intimate lives of celebrities had made him a celebrity himself, though a rather notorious one. Then, though, I had no idea what fame really was. I should not have been nervous, as the store attracted the oddest patrons of the town. The walls were covered with glossies of Kim Alexis and Joyce Carol Oates, a model and a novelist who had once both called Lockport their home. Oates' visits had drawn hundreds to the store for book signings. Other authors, too, stopped in on their tours. The store's manager created the Alexis and Oates displays should they ever return to grace the store, but Jeffrey was in that day, and I, the young sycophant, had made a huge mistake. "You wrote a book! We have it here in the store!" I held out my hand to shake his. "I've written several of them," Jeffrey said, "and you only have one of them here. You should have them all in stock. I live in this town, for fuck's sake." Brenda Giuliano then stepped in front of him with the baby. She spoke softly, kindly, a mother to the world. She needed a few paperbacks for her son's reading program. I was embarrassed, trying to focus on her words. Within a few minutes, the Giulianos were gone from the store, and as writers will do, I hated myself just a little more. Within a few months of the bookstore episode, I became very brave, bought a copy of Giuliano's John Lennon, My Brother, and walked down to his house. I would have to look back on my job interview many years later. It all began when I knocked at the gold ring in the Lion's Mouth on his mammoth front door, and suddenly I was on a trip to London for meetings with publishers, agents, confidential sources, rock and roll royalty, and the English tabloid press. I was in awe of it all. The gigantic airplane, traveling with a real author, my first time overseas, getting my passport stamped, hearing real English accents, my first time away from anything more exotic than Toronto. I was the assistant to the author. I took dictation, answered phones, carried bags, proofread pages, created schedules, made sure that Geoffrey had everything he needed to do his work. First came Britain. When we arrived in London, the first cab ride in a black French goat practically scared the shit out of me. I learned what it felt like to have your heart creep up into your throat. The cab was as comfortable as an open rail car, and the driver must have been going at least 50 miles an hour through the narrow brick-lined streets. Geoffrey, of course, was used to it, so I did not have a chance to take in the sights on this tour. We ended up at the Hare Krishna Temple on Soho Street, a square with a gated garden park at the center. McCartney Productions Limited was 3 buildings away. So was Bloomsbury Publishing. The temple opened to a dingy cafeteria, quite different from the Garden Palace dining hall in the temple we had visited in Toronto. Geoffrey bowed and exchanged Hare Krishna with many bald-headed people, some in ceremonial robes, some plain-clothes. They all seemed full of peaceful, relaxed energy, glistening with cleanliness. They had few worry lines. They were all quite different, though, from my mentor. Adopting an Eastern Indian accent I had yet to hear, Geoffrey spoke with someone about staying at the temple for a few days during our business in the city, and approval was summarily granted. Each night at the temple was restless, because like the YMCA or a city mission, sleeping areas were first come, first serve. The first night, a devotee turned us in for sleeping on 2 Swamis' beds. Though Geoffrey was a long-time devotee, we still had to sleep on the floor. There were to be no special privileges for an author and his assistant. The next night, we arrived back at the temple too late, and negotiations had to be made so we could sleep in a loft on the top 5th floor. It was more of a hallway, and my feet were in the room while my head was in the hall. Geoffrey was in the room, of course. Before dawn, we were awoken by devotees, because we were standing in the way of some kind of flower ceremony of deity worship for Krishna that was supposed to take place on the roof of the temple. The devotees carried a small statue of an incarnation of Krishna, dressed in red and golden clothing. They chanted, prayed, sang, and offered foods to various deities throughout the day. Of course, we got up and moved out of the way. But I still felt asleep standing there in the hall. When the devotees had finished the 10-minute ceremony, Geoffrey and I took our blankets and pillows and went out on the roof to sleep. A light, though chilly London shower woke us an hour or so later. Geoffrey said that no matter what, it was a great honor to be permitted to stay at the temple, especially for me, an American who had not yet accepted the Lord Sri Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We ate breakfast, and I sat next to a nubile, lovely blonde English girl who said her parents were both devotees and she had lived at the temple most of her life. Unlike the other female devotees and wives of devotees, she had long flowing hair, a gleam in her eye, indicating that she might someday choose a different path. They have permitted me just recently to listen to rock music for a few minutes each day, she said. Geoffrey nudged my ribs. He had not heard what she had said. See the type of beauty that is Krishna? See who you will meet here? Welcome to your journey towards salvation, your ticket off the miserable, endless wheel of repeated birth and death. With Krishna there is eternal life. When a devotee dies, he becomes part of Krishna and joins God on his journey of creation and eternal happiness. Geoffrey spoke this way often. I listened, but a lot of it sounded as fantastic, meaning far-fetched, as the Catholics' miracles. I remained open to Krishna because so much was happening so rapidly to me as a writer's assistant. It was all exotic and new, though I was hungry for an American hamburger and a long nap in a real bed. It was then the door of another kind of palace, the one I truly sought, opened up before me. We went to the upscale Groucho Club to meet Tim Hailstone, a literary agent. Opened in 1985, the exclusive Artists Club was an ornate Elizabethan throwback with a parlor, lounge, bar, and dining hall all on the first floor. There was a doorman named Lloyd Gruff, who'd let you in if you were on the list. Geoffrey mentioned the name Tim Hailstone to the doorman, and we were permitted to enter. I kept hesitating, looking behind us, because a man I had seen near the High Street earlier that day, an actor I recognized, was behind us. He was having trouble at the door. The doorman could not find his name in the list. "I am John Malkovich, the actor said. He was tall, balding, the star of Dangerous Liaisons, a most recent epic of mannerisms with Michelle Pfeiffer. John and Michelle were on the cover of every fucking magazine, but did Mr. Gruff know that? No, he did not. I'm sorry, sir," the doorman was saying. "I do not have you listed. What party do you accompany?" I missed the rest of the exchange as we wandered into the front parlor, a large room spotted with many couches and chairs, impressionistic art on the walls, all genuine, of course. I could see the bar beyond the parlor. There was Tim Hailstone, pumping Geoffrey's arm enthusiastically, laughing jolly, smiling grandly, looking the part of a portly extra in the Sherlock Holmes TV series. He ushered us to a table where Geoffrey announced that the great Jojo Lane, the world's most famous groupie, would be joining us within just minutes. My role was to sit and listen while Geoffrey entertained Hailstone on all things Beatles. I was, however, distracted for a moment by a commotion at a table behind us, and there was John Malkovich being seated. He had won the identity battle with the doorman and was now suddenly accompanied by two beautiful young women. I strained to hear the conversation, but was soon drawn back to Geoffrey and his insider's view on Paul McCartney and his great love of the American Linda Eastman McCartney. Hailstone wore the interested look of glee of a man who had finally arrived after much passionate travel to the mountain at the foot of the gods. And then there was Jojo, exploding into the room, the displaced rock star's wife and celebrity groupie, in a jean jacket, black blouse, and jeans ripped to shreds to show her sheer black thigh-high boots. With that outfit and the Elvis smirk, Jojo was by far more out of place than John Malkovich, or even actor Tom Conti, who was sitting nearby. Joe had married and divorced Denny Laine, a founding member of Paul McCartney's Wings, after being in the arms of a who's who of rock royalty, including Steven Tyler, Randy Rhoads, and at that time was the girlfriend of one of Britain's most notorious bank robbers, Peter something or other. Ours was the table drawing the most attention from the Groucho Club regulars, and Geoffrey and Tim grew louder in their conversation as if our credit had just jumped to gold status. I was at a table of tabloid kings in the country that had borne Shakespeare, and hundreds of years later, the brand of yellow journalism that would inspire and redefine the truth for everyone, from William Randolph Hearst to Star Magazine. Tim glanced at me now and then, a polite English gentleman's way of including me in the conversation, but the room belonged to Geoffrey Giuliano and the sultry Jojo Lane. We all then ate and drank, of course, on Tim Hailstone's generous tab. I ate ravenously, duck with wine sauce and a couple of Bombay sapphires and tonics. Geoffrey, of course, had a vegetarian meal, and he never drank. But he entertained, uninvited, half of the room with his stories of Jojo and how she deserved her own tell-all biography. "She lost her virginity to Hendrix backstage at Woodstock," he announced. Jojo nodded. "Fascinating," Hailstone shouted. "I went to the bar and ordered another drink. Then I went to the restroom. Even that was gorgeous. There was a chain above your head that you pulled to flush the toilet. I might have been a little tipsy because I went into hysterics when the water in the toilet swirled in the other direction. The restaurant attendant was in a coat, tails, and top hat. He handed me a linen towel and said, 'Good day to you, sir.' I said, 'I'm from America, Lockport, New York. It's right near Buffalo.' He nodded. This was a world away from that very same morning after leaving the temple and taking a ride across town. I thought we were going to be killed.
I never thought I'd see the likes of you on this high street.
A leather-clad thug told us as we stepped out of a black cab. I was already shaken to the core by this driver who seemed to think he was on the fucking Autobahn.
Jeffrey Giuliano, you fucking yank. You got a lot of fucking nerve coming round here.
It was not exactly the kind of welcome which I had expected. The cab stormed off and we were left there. We had planned on meeting Jojo at her flat. Holding Jeffrey's suitcase, I was starving because we had skipped breakfast in a hurry to meet the rock groupie. I thought we were going to have tea and biscuit at Jojo's flat, but instead we were being accosted in the street. People stopped their walking to watch the increasingly heated exchange. "What is all this?" Jeffrey said innocently, raising his palms upward. Jeffrey had 100 pounds on the thug, but the thug had the deadly white eyes of a hired man. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else," Jeffrey said. Another man approached us, a man who seemed to know the thug. I thought for sure that fists were going to be thrown. The other man, suspiciously, had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. I eased back a few steps, thinking that a knife just might come out.
"Jojo isn't coming out to see you. She says piss off. She doesn't want to see you, and she don't want you here neither. So you go fuck off back home to America."
Again, Jeffrey. "What is all this? What the hell have I done? I don't know what you're even talking about. Look, we got a deal going here, a global publishing deal, and she sent you here to say this? Who are you anyway? What is all this business? Don't you realize who I am? Look, this is all wrong. It's got to be a misunderstanding. Let's go and talk this out." "Denny Laine is my good friend, and his newest songs are great. He's just about ready to release them, and you had to go publish that article. He's going to sue you, Giuliano." It was then that the thug had softened just a little, and all so unexpectedly. The other man studied his own feet. The reason for this matter had now been revealed. While he acted as if he didn't, Jeffrey clearly knew why the man had cornered us. You see, a month before our trip, Jeffrey was quoted in the American Star magazine and the News of the World, England's biggest tabloid, saying that Laine was a washed-up drunk, a failed musician who had taken a minimum-wage job at Jeffrey's house to farm the land. After breaking up with McCartney, Laine disappeared in Spain and subsequently lost his wife, kids, houses, cars, and even had sold his guitars. The articles told the whole story with that added sting that only the tabloids can employ. There had been ugly calls to Jeffrey from publicists, lawsuit threats, calls from journalists around the world, letters, but then, mysteriously, it all stopped. Soon, we were at a cafe near Jojo's house, and Jeffrey was talking to several people, including the thug, explaining that while he had conducted an interview or two about Denny, he had been wildly misquoted, and he was considering suing the tabloids himself because of the outrageous way they had treated the story. "I'm not like that. I don't lie. I'm a writer, an author, who got taken advantage of just as much as Mr. Laine here. I'm as much a victim as he is. I am on your side. I want to hear that new music, too. Christ, I've argued publicly that Denny was McCartney's best writing partner since Lennon." Now, Jeffrey went on like this, and the anger soon shifted to the tabloids. Jeffrey explained that everyone knew the British press couldn't be trusted, for look at what they had done to Lady Diana, to Elton, to every fucking footballer who'd ever had an illicit affair. I am an honest American journalist who makes millions on the sales of my books. Why, oh why, would I ever pick on poor Denny? There's no point to it. It would be completely irresponsible. And then, magically, the situation was now well smoothed over, and through the communication of her friends, Jojo was appeased. She had even agreed to meet us later at the Groucho Club as a guest of Jeffrey. We had been in London for just 4 days, but we had met with editors at Bloomsbury, 3 top literary agents, 5 tabloid reporters. Jeffrey was selling a story about George Harrison's keen interest in Hitler, various photographers, and several musicians who had worked with Paul McCartney. While I had seen Roger Daltrey, the lead singer of The Who, walking down Soho Street, I did not count him as someone I had met because we did not speak. Jeffrey had been engaged in conversation with a devotee outside the nearby temple, and he had yelled at me for not interrupting the conversation so he could speak with Mr. Daltrey. "We might have had lunch with him, Brandon." Whether it was because of our hectic schedule, the meetings where Jeffrey could make money took priority, or by design, we had missed planned meetings with Kim Moon, the late Keith's wife, members of Jethro Tull, and the lead guitarist of Oasis, a new English band that was sure to make it big one day. This was my introduction to the Hollywood art of purposely missing meetings to forge additional importance on the part of all involved. We had left several unreturned messages by phone and in person at McCartney Productions Limited on Soho Street to say that Jeffrey was in town and wanted to speak with Paul about Blackbird, the biography of the soon-to-be knighted Sir Paul that Jeffrey was contracted to produce for Dutton. McCartney had previously only responded through lawyers to say that while he could not discourage Giuliano from writing the book, he could not grant any further interviews and would be checking the finished product for complete accuracy. And so, our money meetings were completed, and Jeffrey said we ought to see the European countryside during our final 2 days there. We gathered our things from the Soho Square Krishna Temple and boarded a train at Victoria Station, bound for Brussels, Belgium. A pleasure trip for the two writers, Jeffrey said. The journey was called a boat train by travelers and tourists. First, you hopped on a train in England, rode it for a couple of hours, then got on a hovercraft at some port or other, and boarded another train that ended up in downtown Brussels. Impressive. Jeffrey fired me while we were on the second train because I had been writing about him in my journal. He wondered why I had suddenly become so non-communicative. He seized the journal and found out that I had written that he was extremely disrespectful towards the women we had met, constantly asking them about their opinions on oral sex. And his cheapness when it came to buying meals. I had no money and was employed by him, and that someday I would write about his behavior. I was angry at him because I was hungry, and my hungry anger was transferred to him because he kept saying that we did not have time to eat. We rode the train in silence for a while. I gazed at the Belgian rail yards and industrial complexes, flat land, gray sky. He gave the journal back to me after writing in it that I had been fired. Night came, and the view changed to streetlights and my own reflection in the train window. Then we arrived in Brussels, and we both realized with a hearty laugh, holding our luggage on a deserted midnight Belgian street, that neither of us spoke French or Dutch, and we had no fucking idea where the Brussels Krishna Temple was. He quickly said that I could have my intern job back if I found the temple. Things got a little weird here. Believers in Krishna would say that we were experiencing the tastes of Krishna, which devotees believe are moments that a devotee finds himself in trouble or lost, and Krishna intervenes with his magic. Preposterous, of course. Jeffrey thought of calling Brenda back in the States because she could find the location of the temple in an international Hindu phone book that Jeffrey had left behind. It had phone numbers and addresses of all the temples, of swamis, of leading devotees, but of course we had no idea how to use a Belgian fucking payphone, or where a phone even was. A woman then approached us. She was attractive, blonde, alone, this late at night, and she met my eye. I asked her if she spoke English. Why, yes, of course. I'm an American, she said. She was as comfortable standing there speaking to me as if we'd met before. She eyed Jeffrey, too. We, too, are Americans. Hello. What do you need? We need to call our contact in America. We need to speak to someone there. Well, you need a phone, she laughed knowingly. I was confused. For once, maybe he was tired. Jeffrey let me do the talking. Yes, a payphone. There are phones right around that corner, she pointed. But, I said, you don't know how to use them? Yes. Well, I guess you ran into the right person tonight, she said. I work for AT&T Global. In fact, that is why I'm here this week. Then she explained how to use the phone to dial America and to get our contact. Thank you, I gushed. Jeffrey was grinning away, and he thanked her as well. Then she went on her way. The phone was the priority, so we called Brenda, but at midnight, Brussels time, it was 4 p.m. in New York, and Brenda was gone and the kids somewhere. No one answered. We were out of luck. Your job is riding on this, boy, Jeffrey said, gazing around, hoping to see the Krishna temple somewhere amidst the great old street. After fast-talking his way out of the fight on London's High Street, I wondered why now he was not being more resourceful. Was he hurt by my betrayal on the train? Frankly, he looked exhausted. Was that it? Or was this a test? A non-religious young man was now, for his dinner, being forced to find a temple of God. For believers, We were about to get yet another taste of Sri Krishna. We lugged our bags up the street, and I searched for an answer to find the temple. "Why don't we stay in a hotel?" I said sheepishly, giving up after half an hour of walking. We had been traveling by boat train for hours on the little sleep we had gotten at the London Temple in the past 3 nights. I was also starving. "Too expensive." "We'll find it. Just keep trying." We were now on some street about a mile or so from the place that we'd gotten off the train, and we had seen no taxis. What would we have said anyway if we even found one? It seemed like the streets had gotten darker, the street signs all reading the same French gibberish, the buildings we passed indistinguishable from one another, just walls of window and brick. Then 2 men turned the corner. They were talking loudly and smelled of whiskey. One yelled out a jovial "Hello" to us, which was a very familiar word. "This may sound like a wild question, but do you by any chance know where the Krishna temple is?" "Krishna consciousness," Geoffrey corrected. The English-speaking man and his friend stopped. "You're standing right in front of it." We looked at each other, and then the building we were standing in front of. The doorway was dark, the windows dark, but there was a plaque, a small plaque, that now that we had been directed to notice, we noticed. It identified the building as the temple, established in 1969. Geoffrey and I explained a surprised, gleeful gaze as he pressed the buzzer below the gold sign. No one came. He rang again. It had to be nearly 1 in the morning. I sat on a luggage bag and hit a new low. I was hungry, dead tired. The glamour had worn off when I was fired on the train. It all seemed over, and I was far away from home. The streets around were dark, like the opening of a mystery flick set in London when a man in a trench coat with a cane tope-de-chopes up the dampened street. The man carries a concealed weapon on his way to a clandestine meeting. He is not an investigator. He's the killer. "Bonjour!" An excited voice came from a window 2 stories above us. "Bonjour!" A shadow was leaning out a lit window. The building was no longer dark. "Haribol!" Geoffrey shouted. "Hare Krishna! Hare Krishna! Hare Krishna! We are devotees," Geoffrey said. "We have come to see the temple." The shadow eased back from the window, and other lights appeared one after another in the windows above. In a moment, the hallway lit up, and the door flung open. A thin, dark-haired man with a 3-day beard leapt from the doorway and into the street. He hugged Geoffrey, and then he hugged me. "You have come! You are finally here! I have been praying for weeks, and Krishna has delivered you. Come inside, right away!" The man's name was Martin, and he was a beautiful man with a beautiful smile. We had woken him. He was thin, barefoot, in traditional robes, as vulnerable and sensitive as a newborn doe. He was beautiful to me, because of his grand welcome and because he fed us almost immediately. A large, sumptuous thali, dal and noodle soup. Martin Devereux was the longtime Krishna devotee at this temple, and he was also the only devotee at this temple. Now, the temple was in a 19th century building and had at one time in the 1980s housed 100 devotees. The numbers, however, declined until a few months prior to our arrival. Martin was the only one left. Some devotees had moved, some renounced the religion, some just wandered away. It seemed like that there had to have been a bigger reason, a grander explanation for the mass desertion, as he offered none. Martin said that he had been praying that someone would come to help him before the international movement's leaders decided to close the temple forever. There was another temple, about 20 miles away, and some devotees had gone there, and it was a castle. There was talk of having only one temple in Brussels, and Martin was very sad about this. I nearly fell asleep in my bowl of soup. Martin ushered me to an empty lodging room and gave me a blanket and a pillow. He offered also a few sentences in French, bowed, and left. I lay in the bed in my clothes and fell asleep with the light on, listening to Martin and Geoffrey in the kitchen discussing the unfortunate changes in the movement over the years. It seemed like I'd only been asleep an hour when I awoke to Geoffrey's voice in the hallway. In the night, someone had covered me with a blanket. I wondered if it was Geoffrey. Geoffrey then tapped at the door and came in.
"What are you still doing in here?" he said. "Come on, let's go explore. We've got to see this." The huge floor-to-ceiling windows were now flooded in sunlight. We were in Belgium. The people here did not speak English. We were in a Krishna temple that everyone had deserted. Our host had fed us last night and said we were sent to him by God. Now, I was not a religious person, never had been. I was raised an agnostic by my parents, 60s hippies themselves. But now, God was all around me. "Come on, wake up," Jeffrey said. "I've been here since 7. You have to come out and see all of this, and get the goddamn camera." Meanwhile, Martin had laid out a grand breakfast for us. I grabbed something, and then Jeffrey and I went down the street. We crossed the gray cobblestone street to an alley that led to the Grand Palace, a city square larger than 5 football fields. I had never seen anything like that before. "This is the first thing I saw when I got up and ran out here this morning," Jeffrey said. "You can't sleep all your life." All of the city's roads led to this gathering place, a former market with tall buildings on all sides, a few dating back to the 16th century. We were standing next to the famous statue of a peeing boy. Around us were the Cathedral of St. Michael. Jeffrey then led me to a building which seemed rather like a New York brownstone. On it was a plaque saying that it had once been the home of Victor Hugo. Karl Marx, too, had written in an apartment nearby. I felt as if I was still asleep. That this was a typical dream of faraway Gothic places and king's palaces. "What are you doing?" I said, noticing that Jeffrey was holding his toothbrush. He had toothpaste on it. "This? Well, I've had it since I got up. I put the toothpaste on the brush, and then I looked outside. I could see this market square from the bathroom window, so I just ran out." I then held up the camera and snapped a shot of Jeffrey in front of Victor Hugo's doorway, holding a toothbrush up to his face. That afternoon, after we wandered the city and Jeffrey bought Brenda a gift, a wooden penis from an art store, a friend of Martin's drove us to Radhadesh, the Krishna temple near the Holland border, where many of the devotees had run away. Fortunately, the driver was much more careful than those in London, and I got to enjoy the miles of hills and pine forests that gave way to the grassy yellow plains. We passed through a stone entryway, and there stood the imposing neo-Gothic chateau. We entered the castle, and our guide explained that American soldiers had seized the place and the grounds and turned it into a hospital during the Battle of the Bulge. The International Krishna Movement bought the chateau in 1980, after it had been vacant for many years. A black inlaid swastika on the floor of the marble foyer told us who had occupied the castle before it was seized in World War II. Hundreds of thousands had been invested in the early 1980s to build the Krishna temple inside the castle, home to about 80 devotees and visited by an estimated 40,000 tourists a year. There was, however, no tour on the day that we had visited. Jeffrey, meanwhile, had become very excited about helping Martin, to whom he had promised to write letters to temples around the world to save the deserted temple in Brussels. "What if we moved here?" Jeffrey said. He talked of looking for houses in the Belgian countryside. "Writers can write anywhere, right? We could make a difference here. In the movement, I mean." Our guide, however, indicated that the temple's dwindling resources were more committed to the castle than the temple in Brussels. Then time ended. The guide drove us back to the other temple, and we took the boat train to London. We said goodbye to the temple president at Soho Street. And so came the end of our trip together in Europe. It happened so fast. Suddenly, we were back at Heathrow Airport, boarding a plane for the United States, home. But even on the plane trip, we drew the most attention of any of the passengers. I had now come to know the power of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, and began to believe in that power, that this might indeed be God himself. Jeffrey had only purchased 2 gifts on this trip, one for his wife and one for himself. In addition to the wooden penis sculpture wrapped in a gift box buried in one of Jeffrey's suitcases, there was a 2-foot-tall statuette of Srila Prabhupada, the late founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Bald, happy, and securely in the lotus position, the statue beamed it all from Jeffrey's hands. He carried this idol of the Swami on board after it had passed through a scanner. People all around watched him carrying the form of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. It was quite real-looking, too, like a little Gulliver. The other boarding passengers looked at the statue, then skeptically at Jeffrey, and then back at the statue. I do not think that there were any other Krishna devotees on that plane, other than Jeffrey, that is, and several asked what or who the little man was. "That is Srila Prabhupada," Jeffrey would answer, slightly annoyed that they did not already know. "The supreme leader for the global movement of Krishna consciousness." Their momentary curiosity satisfied, the passengers went on about their business. We found our seats, and there happened to be one vacant one between us, so Srila Prabhupada was given his own seat on the flight to America, 25 years after the real 70-year-old Prabhupada came to the West to spread the word about the new religion that would dominate the 1960s, encourage devotees to surrender their materialism and earthly forms, to chant his holy name, and be happy. Prabhupada recruited none other than George Harrison and John Lennon, who had become strong advocates for a time. On the airplane trip home, when Jeffrey had fallen asleep against the window, I began quietly chanting, "Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Ram, Hare Hare." The door had been opened for me as well.